The dust of the high plains tasted of grit and regret, a flavor Elias Thorne had grown accustomed to since Martha passed. His homestead, once a small beacon of shared dreams, now felt like an open wound under the vast, indifferent sky. The heat pressed down, relentless, mirroring the weight in his chest. He was 40, but grief had carved deeper lines into his face, making his eyes seem hollow, repositories of a quiet sorrow. Survival was a grim routine, each sunrise a fresh demand on dwindling spirit. He'd ridden into Purgatory Gulch for supplies, a place that lived up to its name, a raw gash of a town clinging to the edge of nowhere, populated by men whose pasts were best left unquestioned and women whose futures seemed equally bleak. It was there, in the gloom of the Bottomless Mug Saloon, that he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her name, he'd learn later, was Ilara. She stood by the rough-hewn bar, her face pale beneath a smattering of dirt, eyes wide and darting like a cornered doe. Jedediah Grimes, the saloon's corpulent, greasy owner, was auctioning off her indenture. Strong girl, good for work, cookin', cleanin'. Grimes bellowed, his voice slick with avarice. Last fella couldn't pay his debts, so she's mine to settle. Who'll start the biddin' for this prime piece of labor? Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He'd seen indentures before, a grim reality of this frontier, but rarely so brazen, so degrading. Men jeered, their eyes crawling over the girl who flinched with each lewd comment. He saw the raw terror in her posture, the trembling of her hands clasped tightly before her. It wasn't desire that stirred in Elias, but a stark, unwelcome echo of his own desolation, and something else, a protective anger he hadn't felt in months. Martha wouldn't have stood for this. Before he fully understood his own actions, his voice, raspy from disuse, cut through the din. $50. A hush fell. $50 was a steep price for an indenture, more than most here could easily part with. Grimes's piggy eyes gleamed. 50 from the widower Thorne. Anyone else? He saw the girl's gaze flicker towards him, a brief, unreadable glance. There was a smattering of counterbids, half-hearted, but Elias, grimly set, raised it each time. He had little enough, but the thought of her enduring whatever fate awaited her at the hands of these men was unbearable. His final bid of $75, nearly all he had from selling 2 calves, sealed the transaction. Grimes slammed a meaty fist on the bar. Sold, to Mr. Thorne. Her papers are here. He shoved a grubby document towards Elias. She's all yours, Thorne, for the next 3 years, or till her debt's paid. The word bought settled like ash in Elias's mouth. He hadn't bought a human being. He'd bought her out of a particular hell only to potentially drag her into his own barren existence. He signed the transfer with a hand that shook slightly, the ink a stark black against the cheap paper. Ilara was led to him, her head bowed. She wouldn't meet his eyes. The ride back to his homestead was a long, silent ordeal, the air thick with her fear and his own burgeoning apprehension. What, in God's name, had he done? The cabin was a stark 2-room affair, swept clean but undeniably empty. The silence inside, usually a somber companion, now felt accusing. Ilara stood just inside the doorway, small and lost, her meager bundle of belongings clutched to her chest. "The other room is there." Elias gestured awkwardly with his thumb. It was Martha's sewing room. "There's a cot." She nodded, a tiny, jerky movement, and slipped into the small alcove, closing the flimsy door behind her. Elias sank onto his own hard bunk, the $75 a gaping hole in his resources, the presence of the girl an even larger one in his solitary life. Sleep was a distant country. He heard her muffled sob, a single, choked sound, and it lanced through him, sharper than any physical pain. He was no savior. He was a desperate man who'd acted on an impulse he didn't understand, and now a terrified young woman was paying the price of his loneliness or his ill-conceived gesture of defiance. The first few weeks were a study in mutual avoidance. Alara moved like a phantom, her presence marked by the scent of fear and the quiet efficiency with which she undertook chores. She cooked, cleaned, mended his worn clothes with neat, almost invisible stitches, her hands never idle. She ate little, her eyes always downcast, speaking only when spoken to, her voice a near whisper. Elias, consumed by his own grief and a deep sense of shame for the transaction that brought her here, found himself unable to bridge the chasm of silence and suspicion that lay between them. The heat pressed down on the parched land, and inside the cabin, the emotional atmosphere was just as arid. He'd try, sometimes. The stew was good, Ilara. A flicker of her eyes, a mumbled, "Thank you, sir," before her gaze returned to her plate, or her hands, or the rough-hewn floorboards. The sir stung. He wasn't her master, not in his heart, but the circumstances of her arrival painted him as such. He knew the whispers in Purgatory Gulch would have already started. Thorne bought himself a girl. The thought made his jaw clench. One sweltering afternoon, while Elias was mending a fence line far from the cabin, a band of coyotes, made bold by hunger, ventured too close. Alara was tending the small, struggling vegetable patch Martha had started. Elias heard the sudden, frantic clucking of his few remaining chickens, then a sharp, terrified cry. He dropped his tools and ran, his heart hammering against his ribs. He arrived to see Alara, armed with a heavy stick, standing defiantly between a snarling coyote and the chicken coop, her face white, but her stance unwavering. She swung the stick with desperate force, connecting with the animal's flank, driving it back a step. Another coyote darted in, and she whirled, shouting, a sound raw and fierce that surprised him. Elias fired his rifle into the air. The coyotes, startled, scattered and fled. He rushed to her side. "Are you hurt?" She was trembling violently, the stick dropping from her nerveless fingers. "No, sir. The chickens, they're all right, thanks to you." He looked at her, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time, not as a purchased responsibility, but as a young woman who had stood her ground. There was a smudge of dirt on her cheek, her hair coming loose from its tight bun, but her eyes, though wide with residual fear, met his. That was brave, Alara. A faint flush rose on her neck. "They were Martha's chickens," she whispered, then looked away, as if she'd said too much. He knew she'd gleaned details of his past life from the silent artifacts in the cabin, a faded dress carefully folded in a chest, a worn book of poetry. That evening, the silence at dinner felt different. Less like a wall, more like a space waiting to be filled. "You knew my wife's name," he said, not accusingly, but with a quiet curiosity. Ilara fiddled with her fork. "I saw her needlepoint, Martha Thorne, her home." Her voice was still soft but clearer. Elias nodded slowly. "She loved this place, tried to make it beautiful." He looked around the spare cabin. "Hasn't been much beauty here lately." A small, hesitant smile touched Alara's lips, so fleeting he almost missed it. "The sunset was beautiful tonight, Mr. Thorne." He hadn't noticed. He'd forgotten to look. The incident with the coyotes shifted something between them. A fragile thread of shared experience. Elias started talking more, not much, but enough to fill the oppressive silences, about the land, the coming winter, the way Martha used to predict the weather by the ache in her left knee. Elara listened, her attentiveness a quiet encouragement. She, in turn, began to anticipate his needs. a warm cup of coffee ready when he came in from the cold morning chores, a patch mended on his jacket before he even noticed the tear. She learned the rhythms of the homestead, her initial fear slowly giving way to a wary competence. The folks in Purgatory Gulch, when he next went for supplies, were less subtle. "Heard you got yourself some proper help, Thorne," a lanky storekeeper drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "Pretty young thing, too." Elias's eyes went cold. "Ilara is a hard worker and a good woman. She's under my protection. Best you remember that." His voice was low, but carried a steel that made the storekeeper blink and mumble an apology. He wouldn't have Ilara reduced to salacious gossip. The $75 had been a transaction of desperation, not ownership. He was beginning to understand that he hadn't just bought her indenture, he'd taken on a responsibility far deeper. One day, Ilara found him staring at a small withered rosebush near the cabin, the last thing Martha had planted. He hadn't had the heart to tend it or to pull it out. "It might still live," Ilara said quietly, kneeling beside it, "if it gets water and the soil is turned." Elias looked at her, her earnest face. "I don't know much about roses. My mother grew them," she said, a rare offering about her past. "Back, before." Her voice trailed off, a shadow passing over her eyes. "Show me," he said. Together, they carefully cleared the weeds, loosened the soil, and brought water from the well. It was a small act, but as they worked side by side, their hands brushing occasionally, a sense of shared purpose bloomed, as tentative and fragile as the hope for the rosebush. As autumn painted the plains in hues of rust and gold, a new rhythm established itself. Ilara's presence was no longer a source of awkwardness, but a quiet comfort. She had a knack for making the sparse cabin feel more like a home, her touch evident in small ways, a carefully arranged jar of wildflowers on the rough table, the scent of baking bread that now sometimes filled the air. She even began to hum softly as she worked, a sound that Elias found surprisingly soothing. He taught her to shoot the old rifle, her initial nervousness giving way to a steady aim. She, in turn, showed him how to set snares for rabbits, a skill from a past she still rarely spoke of, ensuring they had fresh meat as the nights grew colder. The judgment from Purgatory Gulch remained a distant but palpable threat. They were isolated, their small homestead a tiny island in a vast, uncaring wilderness. One evening, a rider approached, not from the town, but a stranger, rough-looking, with eyes that scanned their property with a proprietary air. Heard Jed Grimes sold off an indenture. The man said, his voice a gravelly rasp. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Ilara, who had come to the doorway. "Girl looks like she's worth more than Thorne probably paid." Elias stepped in front of Ilara, his hand instinctively moving towards the axe propped by the door. "This is my property. State your business or ride on." The man's eyes narrowed. "My business is with the girl. Grimes mentioned she might be available for a better offer once her current master tires of her." Rage, cold and pure, surged through Elias. "She is not for sale, or for trade, or for any man's lewd speculation. She is under my roof, and you'll not speak of her that way." The man smirked. "Protective, are we, for a bought girl?" Before Elias could reply, Ilara spoke, her voice clear and surprisingly strong. "I am not bought, sir. Mr. Thorne paid my indenture. I work for my keep, and I am treated with respect here, which is more than I can say for the company you keep." The stranger's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. He looked from Ilara's defiant face to Elias's grim one. After a tense moment, he grunted, wheeled his horse, and rode off, disappearing into the twilight. Elias turned to Ilara, his heart still pounding. "Are you all right?" She nodded, though a tremor ran through her. "He won't be back, I think." "No," Elias said, his gaze following the rider's path. "But there are others like him." He looked back at her, a fierce protectiveness welling inside him. "This is your home too, Alara, for as long as you want it to be. No one will harm you here if I can help it." Her eyes, dark in the fading light, held his. "I know, Elias." It was the first time she had used his given name without the formal Mr. Thorne. It resonated in the quiet air between them, a small, significant shift. The first snows arrived, blanketing the plains in white, isolating them further. The cabin became their sanctuary, warmed by the stove and the unspoken bond that had grown between them. They fell into a comfortable routine, their days filled with the hard work of survival, their evenings with quiet conversation or shared silence that was no longer empty. Elias found himself looking forward to her presence, to the sound of her voice, to the way her eyes would sometimes light up with a rare smile. He was no longer just a widower, existing in the shadow of his loss. He was Elias, a man with a purpose, a protector, perhaps even a friend. One evening, as a blizzard howled outside, Ilara was mending one of his shirts by the firelight. He watched the deft movement of her fingers, the concentration on her face. "You never speak of your family, Ilara," he said gently. She paused, needle still. "There's not much to tell. My parents died of fever when I was 15. I had a younger brother. He didn't make it either." Her voice was flat, devoid of self-pity, but her eyes held a familiar shadow of loss. "I was taken in by a family, then another, ended up indentured to pay for my keep. Mr. Ruleby Selenderdels. Grimes was the worst of them." Elias's heart ached for the hardships she had endured. "I'm sorry, Alara, for all of it." She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Elias. You gave me a safe place. You treated me with kindness when no one else did." "It was a clumsy kindness, perhaps," he admitted, thinking of that awful day in the saloon. "It was enough," she said softly, "more than enough." The wind shrieked outside, rattling the window panes, but inside the small cabin, a fragile warmth held firm. Elias realized, with a jolt that was not unpleasant, that the hollow ache in his chest had lessened. It hadn't disappeared. Martha would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. Ilara, with her quiet strength and resilient spirit, had unknowingly helped him find his way back to the living. The climax of their shared trial arrived not with the winter's final blast, but with the spring thaw. Jedediah Grimes, his business in Purgatory Gulch faltering, rode out to the homestead. He wasn't alone. 2 surly-looking men flanked him. "Thorne," Grimes bellowed, his voice carrying across the muddy yard. "Come out, we need to talk about my property." Elias emerged from the cabin, Alara a step behind him, her face pale but resolute. He'd insisted she learn to use the rifle, and now it was propped just inside the door. "She's not your property, Grimes," Elias said, his voice even. "I paid her indenture. The papers are signed." Grimes sneered. "Papers can be renegotiated, especially when a man's desperate. I need money, Thorne, and she." He gestured crudely at Alara. "Is an asset I undersold. I'm here to take her back, or you can buy her contract out proper, say, another $100. "That's extortion," Alara said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "You have no claim on me." "Quiet, girl," Grimes snapped. "This is between men." He turned back to Elias. 100, Thorne, or we take her. Might rough you up a bit in the process, just for being difficult." Elias felt a cold rage settle over him. He thought of all Alara had endured, her quiet courage, the home they had begun to build from the ashes of their respective pasts. "You won't touch her," he said, his voice dangerously low, "and you won't get another cent from me." Grimes laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Brave words, widower, but there are three of us." He nodded to his men, who began to spread out, their expressions menacing. This was it. The moment all their tentative peace had been leading to. Elias's hand tightened on the handle of the axe he'd brought out. He glanced at Ilara. Her eyes were wide, but she stood her ground, her gaze fixed on Grimes. "Get back in the cabin, Ilara," he said softly. "No," she replied, her voice surprisingly strong. "I stand with you, Elias." One of Grimes's men lunged. Elias met him with the flat of his axe, a jarring impact that sent the man stumbling back. The other charged from the side. Elias sidestepped, but the man was quick, grappling with him. They crashed to the muddy ground. Suddenly, a shot rang out, not from Elias. Grimes's second man, who had been advancing on Ilara, yelped and clutched his arm, a dark stain blossoming on his sleeve. Ilara stood in the cabin doorway, the rifle smoking in her hands, her face a mask of fierce determination. "The next one won't be a warning, Mr. Grimes," she called out, her voice ringing with an authority that stunned everyone, including Elias. Elias used the distraction to throw off his attacker, scrambling to his feet. Grimes, his face purple with fury and a dawning fear, looked from Ilara's steady aim to Elias, who now stood ready, axe in hand. You crazy bitch," Grimes snarled at Ilara. "You shot him." "He was going to hurt Elias," she stated, her aim unwavering. "Leave now, and never come back." The injured man was whimpering, clutching his arm. The other, having seen the rifle and Ilara's resolve, looked decidedly less enthusiastic. Grimes stared, his bluster deflating. He saw not a timid girl, but a woman defending her home and her companion. He saw Elias, no longer just a grieving widower, but a man ready to fight to the death. "This ain't over, Thorne," Grimes hissed, but there was no conviction in his voice. He helped his injured man onto his horse, and the three of them rode away, defeated and humiliated, disappearing back towards the town that seemed to breed such desperation. Silence descended, broken only by their ragged breathing. Elias walked towards Ilara, who slowly lowered the rifle, her hands shaking. "You all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, a shaky smile touching her lips. "Are you?" "Better than I've been in a long time," he said, meaning it. He looked at her, truly saw her, the strength, the courage, the unwavering loyalty. She had saved them both. The $75 had been the best investment he'd ever made, not for labor, but for a future he hadn't dared to imagine. "He called me a crazy bitch," Ilara said, a touch of rueful humor in her voice. Elias reached out, his calloused hand gently touching her cheek. "He called you what you are," he said softly, "a survivor, and strong, so very strong." Her eyes, clear and bright, met his. In their depths, he saw not fear nor subservience, but an equal, a partner. The rosebush by the cabin, against all odds, had begun to sprout tiny green leaves. As spring fully arrived, unfurling across the plains in a tapestry of wildflowers, Elias and Ilara worked side by side, planting a larger garden, repairing the fences, rebuilding not just a homestead but a life. The shadow of the purchase had long since faded, replaced by the solid reality of earned respect and a deep, unspoken affection. Her indenture papers lay locked away in his strong box. One evening, he took them out. "This," he said, holding the document, "means nothing anymore. It never truly did, not in the way Grimes intended." He walked to the stove, opened the firebox, and tossed the papers onto the glowing embers. They watched as the words curled, blackened, and turned to ash. "You are free, Elara," he said. "Free to go, free to stay, whatever you choose." She looked at him, her expression soft. "I think," she said, a gentle smile gracing her lips, "I'm already home, Elias." He reached for her hand, his fingers closing around hers. The cabin was small, the land still harsh, the future uncertain, but they would face it together. The widower had not bought a girl. He had, through a desperate act in a desperate place, found a companion, a partner, and a reason to welcome the sunrise again. Their bond, forged in hardship and cemented in courage, was more resilient than any adversity the frontier could throw at them. They had found their own quiet triumph, a new beginning built on the foundations of mutual dignity and a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of soils. The world outside might still whisper, might still judge, but within the walls of their small cabin, and in the vast expanse of the land they tended together, there was only the truth of their shared journey. A journey from desolation to a quiet, enduring hope. And so, in the harshest of landscapes, the most resilient bonds can form. If their story of courage and unexpected connection resonated with you, remember that strength and love can bloom in the most unexpected places. Consider sharing this story if it moved you.